Listen to the sound of the wind for a moment. The history books often tell us that empires fall because of invading armies, because of fire and steel. But tonight, we are going to look at a different kind of conquest. It is the year 1974. Imagine, if you will, two entirely different worlds existing under the exact same moon. In the sprawling cities of the United States, the night is restless. Sirens wail in the distance, cutting through the cold urban air. Gas stations are dark, abandoned, with long, desperate lines of empty cars stretching down the blocks, waiting for a drop of fuel that might never come. There is a deep, palpable anxiety settling over the nation, a fear that the golden age of the American dream is quietly slipping away into the shadows. Now, let your mind drift away from the noise and the concrete. Travel with me across the oceans, far away to the vast, silent expanse of the Arabian desert. Here, the night is profoundly still. The air is crisp and carries the faint, ancient scent of warm sand and burning incense. There are no sirens here, only the gentle shifting of the dunes under a blanket of cold stars. It is in this profound silence, far away from the panic of the Western world, that the fate of the global economy is about to be rewritten. Before we journey further into this forgotten chapter of history, I invite you to make yourself completely comfortable. Pull your blanket a little closer, let your shoulders drop, and release the tension you have been holding onto all day. We spend so much of our waking lives chasing after money, worrying about numbers on a screen, stressing over bills and inflation. But tonight, as you close your eyes, you will see just how fragile those numbers truly are. You will see that the greatest financial systems in the world are nothing more than a shared illusion. So breathe deeply, let go of the present, and let me take you back to a time when the world was forced to trade its gold for an invisible promise. To understand the silent revolution of 1974, we must first turn the clock back just a little further to the sweltering summer of 1971. For decades, the global economy had been anchored by something heavy, something real, something you could hold in your hands: gold. The American dollar was an undisputed king because every single paper note was a solemn vow, a promise that it could be exchanged for a specific amount of physical gold locked safely away in the heavily guarded vaults of Fort Knox. It was a system built on tangible weight, on the comforting certainty of gleaming metal. But empires, no matter how grand, are expensive to maintain. The United States had been bleeding its wealth into the dense jungles of Vietnam and funding massive social programs at home. The vaults were slowly emptying. The world began to whisper, then to demand, their gold back. The illusion of infinite wealth was beginning to fracture. Imagine the atmosphere inside the Oval Office on a quiet evening in August 1971. The room is dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the outside world. The grandfather clock ticks methodically in the corner, a relentless reminder of running time. Sitting behind the resolute desk is President Richard Nixon. He is a man carrying the unbearable weight of a crumbling economic order. The air in the room is thick with cigar smoke and quiet desperation. He knows the gold is running out. He knows that if he do nothing, the American economy will collapse under the weight of its own unfulfilled promises. And so, in a defining moment of modern history, a decision is made in the quiet isolation of that room, and Nixon decides to sever the tie between the dollar and gold. It was called the Nixon shock. With a simple stroke of a pen, the heaviest anchor of the global economy was cut loose, allowed to sink into the dark depths of the ocean. Suddenly, the dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by absolutely nothing at all, except the word of the United States government. Think about the profound philosophical shift in that moment. The money in people's pockets, the savings they had worked their entire lives to accumulate, instantly transformed from a representation of physical gold into a pure abstraction. Money became an act of faith, a collective belief suspended in midair. It is a terrifying realization when a society suddenly understands that the ground they are standing on is made of nothing but thin air and promises. In the years that followed the Nixon shock, that faith began to waver. Without the solid foundation of gold, the value of the dollar began to erode. Inflation swept across the nation like a silent plague, eating away at the livelihoods of ordinary people. The prices of everyday goods climbed higher and higher, while the purchasing power of the paper money withered away. The superpower was wounded, bleeding out its economic dominance drop by drop. And just when it seemed the situation could not grow any darker, the Yom Kippur War erupted in the Middle East in 1973. The Arab nations, wielding their oil as a devastating weapon, imposed a strict embargo on the United States. The lifeblood of the American industrial machine was suddenly cut off. The panic was visceral. Factories went quiet, highways emptied, and a cold, dark winter loomed over a nation that had once thought itself invincible. The United States was desperate for a new anchor. If gold could no longer hold the dollar steady, they needed to find something else. Something even more essential to the modern world. Something dark and liquid, and buried deep beneath the burning sands. Ironically, the most powerful green paper in the world, the currency that dictated the lives of billions, was now worth no more than the ink printed on its surface, unless it could find a savior in the hands of a king who had never needed it. Now, let the cold, neon-lit streets of America fade away from your mind entirely. Let the sounds of the anxious city dissolve into a deep, comforting silence. We are traveling thousands of miles away, across the dark oceans, towards the vast, sleeping expanse of the Arabian Peninsula. As we arrive, the air changes. It becomes warm, dry, and carries the heavy, intoxicating fragrance of burning oud and ancient sandalwood. We find ourselves in the city of Riyadh in the year 1974. In stark contrast to the frantic energy of Washington, the atmosphere inside the royal palaces is defined by a slow, deliberate grace. Here, time does not rush. It moves with the measured pace of the desert itself. The floors are vast expanses of cool, polished marble, echoing softly with the rustle of traditional robes. In the center of this quiet grandeur stands King Faisal bin Abdulaziz Al Saud. If you were to look into his eyes, you would not see the frantic desperation of a politician facing an election. You would see the profound, heavy gaze of a man carrying the weight of an ancient lineage and the sacred responsibility of guarding the holy cities of Islam. King Faisal was a man of deep, unwavering faith, a ruler who lived a life of ascetic discipline even while surrounded by unimaginable wealth. He was a monarch who rarely smiled in public, not out of cruelty, but because he understood the immense, solitary burden of his crown. To be a king is to be fundamentally alone. While President Nixon was fighting for his political survival amidst the growing shadows of scandal, King Faisal was fighting for the existential survival of his kingdom. He looked out at the Middle East and saw a region engulfed in flames. He saw the rise of radical secular movements, the creeping influence of the Soviet Union, and the constant, bitter conflicts over borders and ideology. His kingdom, vast and sparsely populated, was a fortress made of sand, vulnerable to the turbulent winds blowing across the Arab world. But beneath that sand lay a sleeping giant, a dark, subterranean river of ancient sunlight, buried for millions of years. Oil. For decades, this black liquid had been pumped from the desert floor to fuel the relentless industrial expansion of the Western world. It was the lifeblood of the 20th century. But it was only during the Yom Kippur War of 1973 that the true, terrifying power of this resource was fully unleashed. When King Faisal, in a moment of quiet, calculated resolve, decided to participate in the oil embargo against the United States, he was not acting out of malice. He was drawing a line in the sand. He was demonstrating that the balance of global power had irrevocably shifted. By simply turning a valve, by withholding the black blood of the earth, a desert kingdom had brought the greatest military and economic superpower the world had ever known to a shivering halt. The embargo was a shockwave that cracked the foundation of the American empire. It proved that a nation could possess all the nuclear warheads in the world, could send men to walk on the silent surface of the moon, and yet could still be paralyzed by a shortage of fuel. The vulnerability was laid bare for the entire world to see. Yet, as the winter of 1973 turned into the spring of 1974, the situation grew increasingly precarious for both sides. The United States was bleeding economically, suffocating from inflation and energy starvation. But King Faisal, in his quiet wisdom, knew that a prolonged global depression would ultimately harm his own kingdom. He did not want to destroy the American economy, for a broken America could not stand as a shield against the encroaching Soviet threat that he despised so deeply. Here we find the tragic, beautiful paradox of history. Two men, separated by culture, religion, and geography, sitting alone in their respective seats of power, holding the two broken halves of the world. One held a currency that was rapidly losing its meaning. The other held the physical energy required to keep the modern world alive. They were locked in a dangerous dance, a delicate balance of terror and necessity. And so, while the Western world was screaming in its desperate thirst for energy, with politicians shouting over one another in crowded chambers, in a quiet, dimly lit, incense-filled palace room in Saudi Arabia, a silent solution was slowly beginning to take shape. Imagine the sound of a brass pot gently clinking against a delicate porcelain cup. The dark, bitter cardamom coffee is poured in a slow, steady stream. It is a ritual of hospitality, but also a ritual of patience. In the corridors of power, the loudest voices rarely make history. History is forged in the whispers, in the subtle nods of agreement behind closed, heavy, wooden doors. The United States needed something tangible to anchor its floating, imaginary dollar. It needed a new foundation, a new promise to present to the world. And the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, despite its newly discovered leverage, desperately needed an ironclad guarantee of military protection, a shield to ensure the survival of the House of Saud against the chaotic forces surrounding it. A bridge had to be built between the paper and the oil. It would require a secret journey, a delicate negotiation, and a compromise that would bind these two radically different nations together in a complex embrace that would last for generations. A quiet pivot was approaching, a moment where the axis of the financial world would shift, not with a loud explosion, but with the quiet scratch of a pen on a piece of parchment. Let the heavy curtain of time fall over the spring, and let us move forward into the suffocating heat of July 1974. The situation in the United States had deteriorated from a crisis into a slow, agonizing decay. The stock market was collapsing inward, a silent implosion erasing the wealth of millions. Inflation had reached a terrifying double-digit nightmare, acting like an invisible thief in the night, stealing the value of every dollar hidden under every mattress. And in the heart of Washington, a different kind of darkness was tightening its grip. The Watergate scandal was no longer just a shadow, it was a suffocating shroud wrapping around the presidency. Richard Nixon, the architect of the New World Order, was becoming a ghost wandering the halls of his own White House. He knew his political life was drawing to a bitter, humiliating close. But before the final curtain fell, he had to secure the survival of the empire. He needed a miracle. He needed to tie the sinking American dollar to the only thing left in the world that truly mattered. It is in this atmosphere of profound, quiet desperation that a highly classified mission was authorized. There was no grand press conference, no fanfare, no brass bands playing on the tarmac. Just a quiet, determined man boarding a secure aircraft under the cover of darkness. His name was William Simon, the United States Secretary of the Treasury. A man of cold, hard numbers, stepping into a world governed by ancient traditions and unyielding faith. Imagine the rhythmic, hypnotic hum of the airplane engines as it cuts through the freezing stratosphere. For thousands of miles, Simon sat in the dimly lit cabin, looking out into the pitch-black void of the Atlantic Ocean. He was flying toward Jeddah, carrying a proposal that was as audacious as it was desperate. It was a 4-day diplomatic journey that would barely register in the daily newspapers back home, deliberately kept out of the blinding spotlight of the American media. The public was told it was a routine diplomatic tour, a tour of economic cooperation. But the truth, Hidden beneath the diplomatic smiles was a high-stakes game of geopolitical chess. When the airplane finally descended through the thick, shimmering heat of the Arabian Peninsula, the doors opened to a world that felt fundamentally different. The dry, scorching air of Jeddah hit the American delegation like a physical wall. They were escorted away from the glaring sun, deep into the cool, silent sanctuaries of the Saudi government buildings. Here, the architecture is designed to keep the harshness of the desert out. Thick walls, shaded courtyards, the gentle, rhythmic splashing of a small indoor fountain. The environment itself commands a slower pace, a lowering of the voice, a deliberate calming of the mind. The negotiations took place in a room where the air was heavy, with the scent of roasted coffee and silent anticipation. In the foreground, the polished surface of a massive mahogany table reflects the soft, ambient light. In the midground, men in tailored Western suits sit opposite men in pristine white thobes, the quiet rustle of fabric, the only sound breaking the silence. And outside, looming in the far background beyond the heavy curtains, the vast, unforgiving desert waits, indifferent to the fragile agreements of men. The American proposal was an act of quiet genius, born out of absolute necessity. It was not a demand, it was an intricately woven compromise. The United States would become the ultimate guarantor of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. They offered unconditional military protection, a shield of American steel and technology to protect the House of Saud from its aggressive neighbors and internal threats. They offered to sell them the most advanced weaponry the world had ever seen. But this shield came with a very specific, non-negotiable price, a price that had nothing to do with gold or territory or blood. It was a price paid in pure financial architecture. In exchange for American protection, Saudi Arabia must agree to price all of its oil exports, every single drop pulled from beneath the sand, exclusively in United States dollars. No matter who was buying the oil, whether it was Japan, France, or a developing nation in South America, they could not use their own currency. They had to first buy American dollars to buy the oil. And the second part of the deal was even more crucial. The massive, unimaginable wealth that Saudi Arabia would accumulate from selling this oil, these petrodollars, could not just sit in a vault. It had to be recycled. The kingdom was required to take those billions of dollars and quietly invest them back into the American economy, specifically by purchasing United States Treasury bonds. If you are closing your eyes right now, try to imagine the sound of a fountain pen gliding across a heavy sheet of parchment. Listen to the scratch of the metal nib against the paper in that quiet, air-conditioned room in Jeddah. That is not just a signature. That is the sound of a new world order being born. It is the sound of the American dollar, entirely disconnected from physical gold, suddenly finding a new, indestructible anchor. Through this silent agreement, the dollar was resurrected. It was no longer backed by the shiny metal in Fort Knox. It was backed by the black oil of the Middle East and the terrifying might of the American military. Every nation on Earth suddenly needed a constant supply of dollars just to keep their lights on and their engines running. It was a masterstroke, a bloodless conquest achieved through the quiet alignment of mutual desperation. The illusion of the paper money was restored, stronger than ever, entirely sustained by a continuous, invisible loop of oil flowing out of the desert and green paper flowing back into the United States Treasury. The men in that room shook hands. The deal was sealed, not with a treaty ratified by Congress, but with a quiet understanding between kings and politicians. But as we will soon see, the architecture of power is a heavy, dangerous thing to build, and the architects themselves rarely escape the crushing weight of their own creations. The ink on the confidential documents took only a few moments to dry, but the invisible chains, forged in that quiet room in Jeddah, would bind the world for the next 50 years. The American delegation packed their briefcases, boarded their secure aircraft, and vanished back into the night sky, leaving behind a kingdom forever altered. The crisis of the dollar had been averted. The global financial system had been dragged back from the edge of the abyss, tethered safely to the endless, black rivers beneath the Arabian sand. But history is a cruel and ironic master. It rarely allows the architects of great empires to sit comfortably in the halls they have built. As we descend into the deepest, darkest part of our story tonight, I want you to listen to the slow, heavy heartbeat of time. Breathe in the silence and realize the terrifying weight of power. Let us return to the United States, to the stifling, humid month of August in the year 1974. Only a few weeks have passed since the secret petrodollar agreement was sealed. The American economy is secretly secure. The dollar has found its new lifeblood, but the man who orchestrated this salvation is utterly broken. The walls of the White House are closing in. The Watergate scandal has breached the final defenses. Imagine the suffocating atmosphere in the Oval Office on the evening of August 8. The air conditioning hums quietly, but it cannot cut through the cold sweat of a fallen leader. Richard Nixon, the most powerful man on the planet, sits alone at his desk. He has secured the economic supremacy of his nation for the next half-century, yet he cannot save himself. He picks up a pen much like the one used in Jeddah, and signs a document of profound humiliation, his own resignation. The next morning, step out onto the south lawn of the White House. The grass is wet with dew. The air is heavy with the smell of jet fuel. Listen to the deafening, rhythmic chopping of the helicopter blades as Marine One waits on the grass. Nixon walks across the lawn, his face a mask of tragedy and exhausted defeat. He turns, gives a final, forced wave, and steps into the machine. As the helicopter lifts off, taking him away into the grey Washington sky, he leaves behind the presidency, his legacy in tatters. He saved the American empire, but he lost his crown in the process. Now, let the sound of those helicopter blades fade away into a quiet, mournful whisper. Let us cross the ocean one last time, returning to the pristine, silent marble halls of Riyadh. King Faisal had won a massive victory. He had forced the Western world to recognize the sovereignty and power of the Arab nations. The wealth of the petrodollar system was beginning to flood into his kingdom like a tidal wave of gold, transforming dusty desert towns into sprawling metropolises of glass and steel. But King Faisal knew that unimaginable wealth brings unimaginable danger. He grew more isolated, the burden of the two holy mosques and the sudden blinding riches of his people pressing down on his shoulders. He knew that the sudden influx of Western money and influence would inevitably clash with the ancient, conservative traditions of the desert. He had built a fortress of wealth around his nation, but he could not protect himself from the shadows lurking within his own walls. It is the 25th of March, 1975, less than a year after the secret deal that changed the world. The morning is calm. The air is scented with rosewater and the faint, bitter aroma of Arabic coffee. King Faisal is holding a traditional majlis, an open court where citizens can approach their ruler to pay their respects or present their grievances. It is a deeply intimate, ancient tradition of leadership. A young man approaches the king. He is not an enemy soldier. He is not a foreign assassin. He is the king's own nephew, Prince Faisal bin Musayyad. The young prince leans in, seemingly to embrace his uncle and kiss him on the nose, a traditional gesture of deep, familial respect. The king leans forward, his face gentle, expecting the embrace of his bloodline. And in that fraction of a second, the silence of the marble hall is shattered. The young prince draws a concealed revolver. The sound of the gunshot is deafening, tearing through the sacred tranquility of the court. The king falls, his pristine white robe stained with the dark, sudden reality of mortality. Panic erupts, guards rush forward, but it is too late. The architect of the Arab oil weapon, the man who brought the United States to its knees and then quietly lifted it back up, is gone. Take a very slow, deep breath. Hold it for a moment and let it out. Think about the profound, tragic irony of these two men, Richard Nixon and King Faisal. They were the masters of the geopolitical chessboard. They sat in their quiet rooms and moved invisible pieces that dictated the lives of billions, the flow of oceans of wealth, the destiny of entire continents. They forged a blood pact between paper and oil that still governs the world you live in today. And yet, Neither man lived to see the empire they built. Within a span of 8 months, the system they created swallowed them whole. One was stripped of his honor, exiled to the quiet shores of California to live out his days in disgrace. The other was stripped of his life, bleeding out on the cold marble floor of his own palace, betrayed by the very family he sought to protect. It is a chilling reminder of the absolute fragility of human ambition. We build castles out of sand. We print money out of thin air. We draw imaginary lines across the earth and fight wars over them. We convince ourselves that we are in control, that our wealth and our titles make us immortal. But the universe does not care about the color of our money or the size of our oil reserves. When the final hour comes, the king and the pawn go back into the exact same box. As you lie there, listening to the quiet of your own room, let the heavy, tragic burdens of those two kings fade away into the shadows. Let the struggles for power, the anxieties of inflation, the endless cycle of gaining and losing wealth, let it all dissolve. Because in the grand, sweeping arc of time, it is all just dust blowing across an ancient desert. The years have quietly slipped away since that fateful summer of 1974. The men who sat in that dimly lit room in Jeddah have long since turned to dust, their names etched into cold stone monuments and history books. But the invisible chains they forged, the delicate, complex web connecting paper money to the dark, ancient oil beneath the sand, that web still wraps around the entire globe today. Every time you pull into a gas station, every time you look at the fluctuating numbers of your bank account, every time you hear the news anchors talking about inflation, interest rates, and global markets, you are hearing the distant, lingering echoes of that secret handshake. The United States dollar survived its darkest hour, rising from the ashes of the gold standard to become an unstoppable global force, backed by the undeniable necessity of the petrodollar. But the cost of that survival was an eternal, unbreakable bond to the Middle East, a bond that has defined the foreign policy of a superpower for half a century, pulling it into decades of conflict, complex alliances, and endless wars over the black blood of the earth. It is a profound historical irony. In seeking ultimate freedom and absolute financial security, an empire bound itself forever to the most volatile region on the planet. But tonight, as the world outside your window grows quiet, I want you to take a step back from all of it. Step back from the geopolitics, the economics, and the invisible systems that govern our waking lives. Look at the grand, sweeping arc of human history and recognize a comforting, beautiful truth. Every empire that has ever existed upon this earth firmly believed it was eternal. The Romans built their roads of stone, believing they would march across them forever. The pharaohs buried themselves beneath mountains of solid rock and gold, convinced they could carry their wealth into the stars. And the modern world builds its empires on digital numbers, paper promises, and underground reservoirs of ancient sunlight. But all of it, absolutely all of it, is temporary. When you look at the tragic fates of Richard Nixon and King Faisal, you realize that even the individuals who hold the power to shape the world are entirely powerless against the slow, relentless march of time. They were kings of the earth, masters of the game, yet they could not buy themselves an extra hour of peace or a shield against their own mortality. Power is an illusion. Wealth is a collective agreement. So why do we let these illusions steal our peace of mind? Why do we lie awake at night, our hearts racing, worrying about the bills we have to pay, the numbers in our accounts, the promotions we missed, or the financial uncertainties of tomorrow? Think about how small those worries truly are when viewed through the lens of 1,000 years. The anxieties you are holding onto right now, the stress sitting heavy in your chest. It is just a passing cloud in the vast, endless sky of history. The markets will rise, and the markets will fall. End quote. Empires will print their money, and eventually, that money will become worthless paper blowing through the ruins of forgotten cities. You do not need to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. You do not need to figure everything out tonight. You are simply a traveler, passing through a fleeting moment in time. So, let it go. Let the muscles in your face relax. Let your breathing become slow, deep, and even. Feel the comforting weight of your blanket, grounding you in the present moment. Safe, secure, and entirely removed from the chaos of the outside world. The battles of history have already been fought. The kings have already fallen. The ink on the treaties has long since dried. There is nothing left for you to do today. No more decisions to make. No more burdens to carry. Just the profound, healing silence of the night, waiting to embrace you. If this journey into the shadows of the past has brought you a moment of peace, a quiet perspective to end your day, please consider leaving a gentle subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep these stories alive, night after night. For now, close your eyes. Let your mind drift away across the silent, eternal sands of the desert and simply rest. May you have a deep, untroubled sleep, and we will meet again in the past, tomorrow night.